The first draft of a novel can take months, even years, and it can feel like you have a collection of parts by the time the first draft is done. Because of that, it's important on rewrites to link various parts of the story so that what's left is streamlined but also powerful. Tying various parts of your story together can take many forms, from foreshadowing to red herrings to backstory. It creates a weave of sorts, enhancing what's there and implying a lot more. Connective tissue, as I'm calling it in this presentation, goes a long way to making the story feel internally consistent. It helps your story resonate with readers. It makes a story feel greater than the sum of its parts. In this video, we're going to talk about the various types of connective tissue and how you can use them to turn what might have been a good story into a great one. We're deep into my Mastering Fiction series. So far, we've talked about brainstorming, world building, character creation, then plotting, how to write a scene, and adding tension. This is part 7, and I want to mention that while the videos are self-contained and you can watch any of them on their own, they do build on one another. So if you're new to writing or want a refresher after having been away for a while, or just want a more well-rounded look at the writing process, consider watching them in order. I have one more video ready to go and a couple more I'd like to add to round out this series. I have a few more planned Scrivener videos, including how to compile, so be sure to subscribe to be notified when those come out. Hi, I'm Brad Beaulieu, and I'm a full-time fantasy and science fiction author. I've published a dozen novels, more than 20 short stories, and I love talking about the craft of writing, which is why I started this channel, A Novel Approach. A Novel Approach is dedicated to helping you reach your writing goals by sharing inspiration, technique, and my 20-plus years of experience in writing and publishing. We're going to get into the main content in just a sec, but before we do, I wanted to let you know that this video doesn't have a sponsor, but it is supported by those of you who get value out of these instructional videos and spread the word. Maybe buy me a coffee on coffee.com, link in the description below, and even buy signed books from my online store at quillings.com. Thanks so much for your continued support. It's because of you that I can continue to make free videos just like this one. And for those of you who are new, please consider subscribing so you can keep up on all the latest tips, tricks, and deep dive techniques I'm adding on writing. Okay, so let's dive in. I like to give the origin of each talk, and this particular one came from a seminar that I took at Gen Con back in the day. This is, 15 years ago at this point. Kij Johnson, who is a wonderful short story and novel writer, was giving a talk, and she was talking about how in The Empire Strikes Back, after the Battle of Hoth, Luke Skywalker goes to Dagobah while Han Solo and Princess Leia flee on the Millennium Falcon. That small group splits, and the movie from that point forward until closer to the end has two threads that are running parallel with one another. And Kij was talking about how in the following scenes, references are made from each thread to the other. So for example, Luke on Dagobah, as part of his training to become a Jedi, he fights a Phantom Vader. Darth Vader, who's on the Cloud City on this planet Bespin, knows that Luke will come to him. Luke, back on Dagobah, senses Han's torture later on, and back on Bespin, Vader is preparing a carbonite machine for Luke specifically. And so these threads are kind of echoing one another, which is important for multi-threaded stories, be they movies, novels, or what have you. So connective tissue, what is it? It tightens the storyline. It tightens the relationships between the characters and the world. It runs between parallel threads to form a weave. It connects the various parts of the story, including backstory and future events. Why does connective tissue matter? Well, it binds your story together. It's what makes the pieces feel greater than the whole. It brightens your stories, it deepens them, it enriches them. It's part of what turns a good story into a great one. There are various names, and I'm lumping these together so we can talk about them all in one place. There's backstory, there's foreshadowing, there's a payoff, some event that you're hinting at and you finally give the reader or viewer. There's the tone, and there's that thread cohesion if you have multiple threads in your story. Even deepening character. And so the types of connective tissue that we're going to talk about are future, in other words, setting up some future event in the here and now of the story, present connective tissue, reinforcing established traits or parallel threads, and then past, reaching into the past to help illuminate some aspect of the here and now. So for the future connective tissue, we're going to talk about each of these in detail, but just to list them here, we're going to talk about the prologue, foreshadowing, setting up a payoff, not the payoff itself, the plot, how that builds over time, plot twists, and also red herrings. In terms of present, we'll talk about that thread cohesion that I mentioned, two threads that you want to echo between one another, the tone and the mood, building character, building world, and progressing the plot. And lastly, past connective tissue. So we'll have backstory, payoff, and this is the payoff when it occurs, not setting it up. Same thing with plot twist. And then we finally get to the climax and the denouement at the end of the story. And in order to talk about these things, I'm going to use a timeline and certain anchor points. These anchor points ground the two ends of the connective tissue. One is always in the here and now of the story, and the other is in some other part of the story, either present, past, or future. And these 2 points, these events in the tale, play off one another somehow, complementing or contrasting perhaps. They enhance the story's present, importantly. And so the story continuum will have the past on the left, the future on the right, and each story, not everyone will have a prologue, but it could, but then we'll have the start of the story with the inciting incident, the story develops over time, and we'll finally have the climax and the denouement at the end. And then these anchor points I'll be using again to tie 2 parts of the story together. And the case study I'm going to use for this one is The Incredibles. Why The Incredibles? Well, it's a short-ish movie. It's tightly plotted. Pixar does such a good job on almost all of their stories, their movies, and it has a ton of great examples of connective tissue. And I know this is a movie and not fiction per se, but story is story in many respects. And connective tissue absolutely applies to this kind of story as much as it does narrative fiction. So just as a reminder, I'll go over the cast. So there's Mr. Incredible, Bob Parr. He's a Superman, super strength type of guy, a brick. And then there's Elastigirl Helen. She's stretchy, a la Mr. Fantastic. They have a daughter. Her name is Violet. She has invisible and shield powers, kind of like Sue Storm. There's their son Dash, who is a speedster, a la Quicksilver or the Flash. And Syndrome is the main nemesis, the antagonist, and he's a gadgeteer. He has an ally, a lieutenant named Mirage, and Bob Parr has a friend named Lucius who is a super as well, and he is Frozone, a la Iceman. And lastly, there's Edna, who is a costume designer for this group and other supers. So we'll start with future, go into present and past, and the first one is prologue. The prologue is a special scene / chapter that not only illuminates the past, it sets up expectations for the future. In other words, the prologue is not there just to illuminate some part of the past. The unwritten contract with readers is that if you have a prologue, it's going to matter to the start of the story and the development of the story itself in some way, but more importantly, the climax and the denouement as well. In effect, you're going to have 2 starts of the story, and both of them should be echoed in some way in the climax and the denouement, the close of the story. In The Incredibles, there's a prologue, and Mr. Incredible is going around town, and he's fighting crime in essence, and he meets up with Elastigirl at some point, and she takes down one of the villains that he's trying to apprehend, and they have an exchange that makes it clear that Bob has some important appointment that he's supposed to be at later that day. And then Mr. Incredible continues, and he fights more crime. He gets wrapped up in like 5 or 6 things, one after the other. At one point, Buddy, the head of Mr. Incredible's fan club, shows up, and he's made his own boots to help Mr. Incredible. He wants to be Mr. Incredible's sidekick in essence. He calls himself Incrediboy to go along with Mr. Incredible. Mr. Incredible says, "No, go home, Buddy. I work alone." And that hits Buddy hard. Buddy shows up later and messes up one of Mr. Incredible's crimes that he's trying to stop. Bon Voyage is trying to steal money from a bank, and because Buddy is there, Mr. Incredible gets distracted, and a bomb gets attached to Buddy's cape, and he flies off kind of accidentally, and then Bob saves him and gets the bomb off him, but in doing so, he breaks this tram line, and the people on that train line are saved, but some of them are injured. And another person that Bob saves that same day was injured. And the prologue ends with Bob and Helen getting married, but right after it triggers all of these lawsuits. Superheroes, you understand, are sanctioned by the government. Because of these lawsuits, it's the government that's paying for them, all the different damages that are assigned through these court cases and such. And the political winds shift against supers, and they're forced to go underground. And then there's a 15-year gap from the end of that prologue and after all these lawsuits to the beginning of the story, the start. And so the prologue sets up this situation where the supers have to go underground. It also gives us some insight into who Buddy is because he later becomes the main antagonist. He becomes Syndrome, the Gadgeteer. And Syndrome's goal is to bring the supers down, to humble them, to give superpowers through these gadgets he creates to everybody, because if everybody is a super, no one is. And so you can start to see how the prologue is connected in some way to the start of the story, because we have this big gap. The supers do go underground. Helen and Bob get married at the end of the prologue, but then they have kids. So by the time the story opens, they have Violet and Dash and a young baby named Jack Jack. And you can also see how it's echoed in the climax and the denouement. Buddy becomes Syndrome, and he hatches this plot to not only get Mr. Incredible and prove to him that he's better than him and doesn't need him anymore, but also to become the hero himself. And secondarily, to give superpowers to the entire world, not just the superheroes. He has an axe to grind against all supers, not just Mr. Incredible. And so the prologue is linked to all of those things. You don't know that at first. You feel it instinctually because the prologue takes a special place. It's the opening of this particular story. And so you feel like, and justifiably, it will be echoed in the start of the story and then the climax and the denouement. And that certainly happens here in The Incredibles. Then we have foreshadowing. So foreshadowing is a warning or indication of some future event. And typically you'll have several of these before the event itself. And what we're talking about here is you're writing the bit of foreshadowing before the event shows up. And so you're hinting at something. You are connecting the here and now of the story to some future event. You're giving the viewer, the reader, some clue that something else is coming down the line. And hopefully that is going to be a surprise of some sort. It won't be exactly what they expect, but it builds suspense in the reader. They wonder what's going to come and what form it will take. In The Incredibles, Mirage, who is Syndrome's lieutenant, Buddy's lieutenant, she's speaking to someone mysterious as she observes Mr. Incredible and Frozone reliving their past. So again, this is now into the story itself. This is actually in the start before the inciting incident occurs. Bob misses the old days. He is now forced to live a normal life. His secret identity is his only identity at this point, and he really liked being the hero. And now that he's being forced to live a normal life, a family life, he really wants to relive his glory days. He tells Helen that he's going out with Frozone, Lucius, to bowl. And what they're really doing is going and listening to police scanners. And if they find something in the area, they go and try to deal with it in some way, whether it's a crime or, in the case of the movie, it's a fire that breaks out. And so they break into this burning building and they save the people that are there. And they crash into a neighboring building as the building is coming down. It turns out to be a jewelry store, and so they're nearly caught, and the cops think that they're thieves of some sort. They end up escaping and getting back home, but you see right at the very end, Mirage is talking to somebody. We don't know at the time who that is. It's another of Syndrome's lieutenants, and she says, "We finally found him. He's going to want to know about this one." What Mirage is revealing there is somebody, some group, has been looking for Mr. Incredible specifically, and they have now found him. And so that is the true inciting incident of the story. We see Bob and Helen and the kids in the normal everyday life. Then Bob goes out with Lucius to fight crime, relive the glory days. And right at the end, Mirage talks to someone. That is the inciting incident, but it also has some foreshadowing. Who is Mirage speaking to? And there are other hints along the way that she is an agent of somebody, and that somebody has nefarious plans. We don't find out Buddy's identity, Syndrome's identity, until later in the story. But that's foreshadowed several times along the way. So we're just giving hints that something is coming. Payoffs are something satisfying that you're going to give the reader at some point, something that you build towards. That could be a fight of some sort, that could be an argument between two people that you know is coming for quite a while, and finally it's there and they get to release their emotions. It could be two people sharing a night together after tons of hints in a romance. In The Incredibles, Mirage contacts Mr. Incredible and offers him a job, and it comes right on the heels of him getting fired from his insurance job, this really boring job that he's being forced to do as part of his normal everyday life. And Mirage tells him that she's part of this company and they were building this robot that was meant for maybe peacekeeping type purposes, perhaps war. And it's a learning robot and it's escaped. And so everybody on the island that it was built on is in danger, so it's been evacuated. And they need somebody to go to the island, defeat the robot, disable it, but not destroy it completely. Bob takes on that assignment. He's promised more money than he had before, tons more than at the insurance job, and he gets to the island, and there's hints of that along the way. We're told about the robot, we're told more about it on the plane ride toward the island, and then there's this search for the robot through the island, and they kind of hold off on the fight scene for a little while. And so there's kind of like three hints, build-ups to this payoff that's coming. And then the battle between Mr. Incredible and the robot takes place, and it's really exciting and cool. And that is a payoff. That was really fun for the viewer, right? And that would be the same for you and your story if you're hinting at something and then you deliver it. It just becomes that much more fun, engrossing, horrific, sexy, what have you. Whatever your story is trying to do, it will enhance it if you hint at it a few times before you deliver it. Another example is Elastigirl smacks Mirage across the jaw, knocking her out. There were hints along the way. First of all, Bob lies to Helen about the job. He says he got a promotion, and he says he's going to these conferences, when what he's really doing is taking plane rides to the island and helping Mirage and their company deal with this robot, run amok. And then later on, Helen finds a white hair. Mirage has platinum blonde hair, and she finds this on one of Bob's suits. And then she sees that Bob's old costume has been repaired. And so she knows something is up, but she doesn't know exactly what. But clearly she's thinking that Bob is cheating in some way. And so when she finds Bob with Mirage and they're together and they're actually hugging one another as Helen comes across them, all the emotions that she had been building up, her frustration at being lied to, comes out, and then she punches Mirage across the jaw and she collapses. And so one more example of a payoff. It's just that much more exciting for the reader if you can build it up a bit. Payoffs are set up over the course of the story. Eventually you're going to pull the trigger by giving the reader what they want. So the maxim here is increase tension through simple repetition and by lengthening or perhaps shortening the time between these occurrences. Why? Because building tension increases reader involvement and eventually reader satisfaction. Let's move on to the plot itself. So we're setting up the climax all throughout the story. I mean, even in the prologue and the start of the story as well, but we're going to be building as we write our scenes and move from Act 1 to Act 2 and then finally to Act 3. So the plot sets reader expectations for what is to come, playing against what has come before, and the reader is constantly revising their expectations of what's going to happen at the end of the book. In The Incredibles, Mr. Incredible's ally, Mirage, turns out to be an enemy, and it slowly sets up a big confrontation between the family and the robot, and eventually Syndrome. What Syndrome is trying to do is to create this self-learning robot, and he actually enticed other supers to come to the island and do the exact same thing that Bob is trying to do. The robots learned more and more. Some were defeated, others killed supers, but they got better and better until the point where Syndrome felt it was ready for Bob, Mr. Incredible himself. And that's not the end goal. He's not just trying to defeat Mr. Incredible and teach him a lesson. He is trying to make this robot the best it can be to defeat really any super and then send it to this big metropolis and be the hero. He's going to go there and defeat the robot himself, or make it look that way, because he has full control over it through this bracelet that he has. Through that, he will become a super and distribute technology to others and make everybody supers. And then there are setups for plot twists. This is similar to payoffs in that some early anchor point or multiple anchor points relate to some later event. In this case, it sends the story on some new and unexpected direction. Mr. Incredible was brought to the island, for example, not to help defeat a robot in partnership with Mirage and her fictitious company, but to test a robot strong enough to defeat even him. So that was the point at which the story really changed, and our understanding of what's really going on changed as well. Bob didn't actually know at that point, but we the viewer do. Now, not all plot twists are telegraphed heavily. Some blindside the reader, and the events leading up to the twist are digested after the fact. If you do blindside the reader, if you make it a pretty big surprise in the course of the story, you still need to set up the twist behind the scenes. You have to know what's going on, because I think you do need to show what happened. The characters will wonder what the heck is going on, and they may investigate after the fact. And so you need to know so that you can dole that out later on. If you don't do that, the twist will seem arbitrary and unsatisfying in the end to the reader. Red herrings. Red herrings set improper expectations on the part of the reader, and they're either on purpose or by accident. In mysteries, for example, there are a lot of clues to go through, and you may have some red herrings that are just because there's so much to sift through. But others are done on purpose by certain characters, maybe the antagonist, maybe one of their allies, to foil the heroes, the detective, whoever. They're integral to mysteries and natural as the characters try out different leads to solve the whodunit. In The Incredibles, Bob tells Helen he got a promotion to throw her off the scent. He's been fired from his insurance job, and he really, really doesn't want her to know that he's jeopardizing the family's safety and their secret identities again. He's done this multiple times, we find out early on in the story. And the government has moved him each time. After Bob and Frozone break into this jewelry store by accident, just trying to escape the burning building, the government lead that used to be assigned to them shows up one more time and says, "We can't keep doing this, Bob." And he says, "You're on your own." And then he does a step back and says, "Well, maybe I can do it one more time, just for old time's sake." And Bob says, "No, I can't do that to my family again." And so we get the impression that Bob really, really does not want Helen to know what he's doing. And so he tells her that it's a promotion. And so that is a red herring for Helen. We see her kind of struggling with what is going on. She sees Bob working out more. He gets a new car because of this promotion, and he's changing. And she doesn't know why. And so that's part of the lead up to that smack across the jaw. She's thinking that maybe he's cheating on her in some way. And it all starts with that red herring that Bob threw. And now we're going to shift to present. So I mentioned that thread cohesion. If you have multiple threads in your story, and epic fantasies are really famous for this. There's a lot of different POV characters going on. And so this becomes really important in that type of story. But even if you have something like you're giving some hint as to what the antagonist is doing, there are other things going on in any story beyond the POV character, the protagonist. And so you'll want to think about this a bit so you can illuminate other threads in the main thread of the story. But if you do have like 2 or more formal threads going on, it's important to link those threads in some way, not only to keep them fresh in the reader's mind, but to make the story feel like it's a cohesive whole. In The Incredibles, when he goes to that island, Elastigirl finds that long white hair on his costume. So that is a link from her to him on that island. She later finds that Mr. Incredible's old suit has been repaired, and that leads her to Edna. But Bob had already been there. And so that's, again, connecting their 2 somewhat separate threads at that part in the movie together. On the island, Mr. Incredible discovers a database of supers, some of whom have been eliminated by Syndrome. And so he's able to break into this computer system, and he sees the robots and their iterations, and he's starting to get more and more horrified. And then he's like, oh my God, has Syndrome found Elastigirl? Has he found my wife? And so he does a lookup, and he finds that, in fact, she hasn't been found, and there's this big sigh of relief on Bob's part. And then back in Helen's thread, she goes to Edna because of that torn suit. And Edna tells her that she has these new suits for not just Bob, but the whole family, because she knows about their powers, Violet, Dash, and Jack-Jack. And she also tells Helen that each of them has a tracker. And she says, do you want to know where Bob is right now? And so Helen does look for him, finds him on the island on this little readout, but at the same time, Bob's suit starts to make this beeping, and it's detected by these sensors inside of the hideout that he's in. And so again, that's another clear connection between these 2. So they're just playing back and forth. And it really goes a long way to make it feel like these 2 things are working together in conjunction with one another. Then we have tone and mood in the present. The tone of the story is one that you establish from the very first page. It's something you continue throughout the whole story, sometimes strengthening or weakening the effect to suit the characters and your plot. If it's a new tone for you, it will often take constant attention until the voice feels natural to you. In The Incredibles, the tone is light and comedic, and it evokes a 1960s James Bond film with a golden age of comics backdrop. It's a really cool mashup of those 2 genres. And then character building. A character isn't built in a single page, scene, or chapter. It's a slow accretion of decisions, reactions, and emotions that fixes the character in the reader's mind. And so as you build, it sets expectations. The character now is linked to their past. We come to expect certain things from characters, and it's linked to their future. We expect that to continue, and you can either meet or break those expectations. Then there's world building. Similar to revealing character, world building happens over the course of a story. The things you show imply many other things to the reader, and the reader expectations build as you broaden their knowledge of the world. In The Incredibles, the world of the supers is revealed to us in bits and pieces. There are historical flare points, starting with the very opening of the story. And that ended in all of those lawsuits, but you get the impression there was a bunch of stuff building up to that. Like, that was just the straw that broke the camel's back. And there was a bunch of things where the public was starting to get uneasy with supers in general. So there's public perception as well, and how they feel about supers, and that changes over the course of the story, but we understand how that led to the supers going underground, and how they're staying hidden throughout the course of the story, and then what happens at the end of the story. They come to accept them again. The government being involved. The cultural aesthetics, that James Bond, Golden Age of Comics backdrop. Use the iceberg principle to your advantage here. When revealing character and world, remember that readers extrapolate from what they're told. They're really good at it. We are good at it. It isn't necessary or desired to go into exhaustive detail, so use that to your advantage. Show them the tip of the iceberg and they will get or infer the rest. Now, the plot is a type of present, connective tissue. The various parts of the story are building towards the climax. It's outside of the scope of this particular talk. There are plenty of other talks and books on the subject, including my Mastering Fiction video on plot, but it's just too big to talk about in something like this. But I mention it just for completion's sake. And then let's talk about backstory. The story reaches into the past to reveal information about the world or the characters or both. There's danger here because backstory is inherently low tension. The information, as I've harped in my other videos, should be necessary to the story now. The rule I like to use is make the reader want the backstory before you give it to them. How? By making the past, whatever it is, relevant to the present. In The Incredibles, the history of the supers is a constant theme, from the exploits to monologuing, a theme in comics and comics movies, to Edna and her costume designs. So just to illuminate this point, Edna is talking with Bob about the new costume design. Bob only wanted his costume fixed because it got torn by that first robot, but then he's getting into it and he's like, oh, it would be really cool if I had a cape. And that sets Edna off. She gets all annoyed. It's a point of pride for her to build workable, usable, but very fashionable costumes at the same time. And then she goes on this diatribe of all these supers that have died. And the reason that you're ready for that is because Bob wanted it and Edna is now denying it. And she gives reasons for it. And that gives you an excuse to talk about the past. So you want to do that really anytime you want to pull in backstory. Make the reader want to hear about it first. Try to pull as much of that into conversation as you can. Don't go into these big info dumps, and make it palatable for the reader. And then move on, get back to the story as quickly as possible. We mentioned those payoffs earlier, and those were the setups. And now we're delivering. It should follow naturally from those setups, but still be somewhat of a surprise. In the case of Elastigirl, she is the voice of reason. She is the reasonable one with Bob and trying to get him to not be worried so much about the past and live in the present and enjoy his family. But her emotions overcome her when she sees Bob hugging Mirage, which was innocent, and she just punches her and knocks her out, essentially. But it was that much more enjoyable because we knew who she was over the course of the story, and we also saw her getting more and more frustrated by the hints she was getting from Bob that something was not as it seemed. And just to be clear, the reason I put this into the past is because we have reached the point of the payoff, and the reader will be thinking about those past events, and they will absolutely affect the payoff itself when they come across it. And so we want to set that up and then deliver. On a similar note, plot twists are set up and then we deliver those as well. Again, if it was a surprise to the reader, no setup in other words, you'll need to start revealing some of that build up to the reader through the characters interrogating things, investigating, what have you, talking to people and finding out what happened, just so it doesn't feel like a totally arbitrary decision on your part, the authors. So in The Incredibles, Syndrome, Buddy, is revealed, and some of the things that we saw earlier start to make sense. Mirage following Frozone and eventually coming across Mr. Incredible, the first robot, and what it was really meant to do. In this underground lair, Mirage is talking to somebody and Bob sees it, but he only sees the silhouette of the other person. And so we don't quite know who that is yet. We don't know that Buddy has become Syndrome at this point. And so by the time the plot twist comes and we understand what Syndrome is really trying to do with these robots and how Mirage is helping him and why they lured Bob to the island, it just becomes that much more enjoyable. And then we mentioned the plot leading up to the climax. So the climax pulls together everything that's been building since the start of the story and throughout the plot. Like most of these things, it needs to flow naturally from those events while still surprising the reader. It's one of the toughest things in fiction to nail the landing on the climax. It needs to scratch the reader's itch for a satisfying resolution to the tale while still providing that bit of surprise. In The Incredibles, the family teams up to defeat the robot and Syndrome. They work together, where before the parents were overly protective of the kids and each other. So it ties together both the external arc, Syndrome and his goals to defeat Bob and give everybody technology and be the hero himself, and the internal arc of this family unit, which is driven by a lack of trust between all of them. And so they do trust one another at the end, and it's only through that trust that they're able to defeat the robot and then Syndrome. Finally, the denouement. So this is a small scene that wraps up the tale. In the case of The Incredibles, after they've defeated the robot and Syndrome, they attend a track meet at Dash's school. They've allowed him to race, and so they trust in him to not reveal his superpowers, and Dash, on his end, is more responsible. He does do that, for them. He does as they ask because he knows the dangers that are involved with revealing themselves. Violet was very shy in the beginning, and she's much less so during this track meet, so we see her change as well. Mr. Incredible and Elastigirl are much more trusting of their kids, as proven by their teamwork against the Underminer. So right at the very end, this mining machine and this mole-like supervillain comes out and says, "I am the Underminer," and he's going to take over the city or what have you. The Incredibles family put on their masks and they're ready to fight the Underminer together, and that's where the movie ends. And the fact that they do that together is very important. It shows that they haven't reverted to their old selves. So we've seen some change during the denouement, and now we've seen that the lessons that they learned throughout the story and during the climax have stuck. And this is why that denouement is so important to any story and satisfying for the reader in the end. So some tips for applying these concepts. As you're crafting the story, consider connective tissue. Think about how one element in the story affects or is affected by other events. I would recommend not worrying too much about this while you're writing. The time for thinking about these concepts is during plotting or in revision. Why wait? I often find that I can't see the whole story until it's all written anyway, and many things will come clear as you complete the tale. And I like to protect my writing time. It's difficult enough to get into the world and into the story, and trying to think about all this stuff while you're writing can be a bit too much. So during planning, during revisions, go ahead and worry about this stuff. But while you're writing, you have a scene that you've developed. Just go ahead and write it. Live in that world, inhabit it, make it as exciting as you can, and worry about these other stuff at other times. In your revision planning then, pay attention to each of the connective tissue types you used. Can you create resonance where there was none? Can you enhance what's already there? Does your climax echo your prologue? Are your payoffs satisfying without leaning into melodrama? Does the denouement reinforce the change in the characters? Are plot twists set up in a reasonable yet surprising way? Is the backstory revealed necessary and interesting? Did you make the reader want it? Wrapping up, connective tissue, I would contend, helps to make your story feel like a whole, not a collection of parts. It enhances your fiction by making it feel more cohesive and by highlighting the things you want to highlight. It increases reader investment and satisfaction. Try to fold in these concepts early in a draft while plotting and again during revisions, and try short stories to strengthen some of these writing muscles. When it comes down to it, connective tissue is really about recognizing the connections you're already aware of and enhancing them for dramatic effect. It goes a long way to making your story really sing, but it takes time, attention, and effort. And some of this will feel awkward or artificial at first, but you'll get better at enhancing and connecting the various elements of your story over time, and begin doing some of these things on the front end instead of the back end. Now I'd like to turn it over to you. Is there any sort of connective tissue you think I missed? Have you done this sort of thing before, and has it helped to make your story feel deeper than it was? Do some of these types of connective tissue come easier to you than others? As always, if you found this talk useful, I hope you'll like and share with those who might gain benefit from it. As I mentioned, I have one more Mastering Fiction video ready to go, a few more in the planning stages, and some more Scrivener how-tos I hope to tackle soon. So hit subscribe to be notified when those come out. Until next time, everyone, dream big, stay positive, and keep writing. Peace, everyone.